that you've written is kind of all about the separation of nature and politics. And one of the key moments I thought where this crystallizes is around the reality of natural disasters. And it felt like maybe a good place to start because there's so many examples. Like there's countless examples now. And that's part of the point. You say that natural disasters have classically stood as the example of the difference between nature and politics, between misfortune and injustice, domination and accidental adversity. Um, these disasters are, I think, still rarely thought about in terms of what you call human social arrangements, which means we cannot indict them, as you put it. So right now, earthquakes in Afghanistan and floods in Pakistan are having a catastrophic impact on the people who live there. How does focusing on the unnatural nature of those disasters help us kind of understand the political truth of these events that we're told are just sort of acts of God, so to speak?
I love starting with this question because, in a lot of ways, disasters are where my interest in climate and politics and nature come from. I first got into thinking about climate change after and around Hurricane Katrina in New Orleans, which now we just passed the 20th anniversary like a week ago, and that was kind of a real like moment of I don't know, like almost shock for me that it's been so long because I spent a bunch of time in New Orleans after Katrina, and then wrote my undergrad and master's theses on disaster politics. So I was very much interested in thinking about precisely this kind of this problem of the things that we have taken to be acts of God or sort of like just misfortunes, and how we actually need to attend to the various like ways that political whether social features like where who lives where, or kind of political responses around evacuation, things like that play into it. So I thought about disasters in that sense, but this book I think is trying to go kind of like on a different level of thinking about the politics of disaster and natures, where it's not just how do we, there's like a famous phrase, no such thing as a natural disaster, which I think is true in terms of how we understand like who is vulnerable and at risk and how we respond to those things. But this is really just, when we think about something like climate change or the Anthropocene, we're really in this terrain of just like, it's not even clear what nature is anymore. That the hurricanes themselves and, whether it's sort of stronger hurricanes that are coming off a warming Gulf, or, more intensive flooding in different parts of the world, or droughts or wildfires. We're entering fire season in the West Coast in the US right now. Like all of these things are very hard now to disentangle from the sort of political decisions that societies have made, not just about like where to build houses or something like that, but about like producing the very atmosphere that generates these things, about sort of changing the ways that that forests are growing and drying out and dying and catching fire. All of these things have just been so drastically remade by human action, that we can't really sort of treat any of them as natural at all. And it's really, I think, it's very muddy sort of where that distinction can be drawn. And then from that, I think we often talk about these as being caused by human action in some way, or sort of like social forces. But what I really wanted to do in this book is say, well, it's human action, but specifically it's human action within a capitalist system that sort of channels our action in particular ways, that has sort of driven certain kinds of action, and produced that. It's really capitalism that has produced sort of like the produced and changed the planet in this way, to such a degree that we're now living in a world that we can't really separate out what the natural disaster is anymore.
Yeah, and that's a great kind of launching point. And I weirdly want to kind of bypass a bunch of the questions that I initially thought I'd ask, which I want to come back to about, commodifying nature as like a core conundrum kind of the book. Like, how does it, yeah, how does capitalism even sustain itself without pricing nature? Like, that seems to be the conundrum. But instead, I feel like it kind of weirdly makes sense to jump to your reading of Shel Silverstein's The Giving Tree, which is this example you use in the book's epilogue to unpack the idea that you've kind of been circling around for like the whole book in a way, which is the problem of capitalism's creation of these conditions that you describe as unfreedom. Um, So I guess I'll put it like as simply as I can. Could you tell us why you think we might be misreading the giving tree and why it's about more than the selfishness of human nature?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I love that question. The Giving Tree has always been. It's funny, I grew up like reading The Giving Tree and kind of having probably like a childhood memory of it, as I'm sure many of us do. That was just kind of like a fond memory of the sweet story. And then I read it as an adult, and I was like horrified by it because it's so disturbing. This like bratty little kid just takes everything from this tree and chops off all her branches, and it is the tree is described as her, and like leaves her as nothing but a stump and then comes back at the end and like sits on her stump and she's like happy to have him back. And it's really like grim. And a lot of feminists have read this as like a kind of
Incredibly.
parable of like motherly love, or like the kind of image of mother, the mother as sort of endlessly giving and, requiring nothing in return, and just self-sacrificial and all of these things, and like have had a critique of that. And I think that's totally that's a really good critique, because it is very much like this kind of maternal figure. And then there's like a kind of ecological like look at this, just like this is human beings just destroy the earth. But I think it's very interesting. So like, and that what I try to say is like, well, the boy kind of like, the story is about the boy in the tree, but the boy like leaves, he goes out into the world, he like sells the branches, he like buys other stuff, he's not just kind of like chopping them down and building a little house or whatever, he's like going into the realm of like the market, he's like participating basically in a capitalist society and economy, with these things that he's like taken from the tree, from the apples to the branches to the trunk. And I think that that's like sort of the part that we don't see in the story, because it's just kind of this like dyadic relationship, but they live in, they exist in this whole other world of like social forces and pressures that if you read, I think if you actually read like a lot of, like a news article about, like kind of forest depletion in the Congo today, it's like often people who are like, I have to cut down the trees for firewood that I sell in the city because like I have no source of income. Like people are buying the wood because they need fuel. I have nothing else. They're often like, I don't want to cut down the trees. I'm worried about the forest. I know this is bad for like even like the climate. People have like an awareness of these things, but they don't really have other options. And so I think rather than just being like, look at this like greedy little kid, even though he's like a real brat in the story. I think there's something indicative about that general relationship where like we have to take a step back and sort of situate that within like, well, why are people doing these things? It actually just because they are selfish and greedy, or are they sort of being compelled by the sort of social order which they have to participate in to survive.
I know, yeah, like that to me is what's so wonderful about this epilogue in the reading of the Giving Tree, which, is an interesting cultural touchstone. It's not as uh, obvious in terms of its allegorical import as something like the Lorax may be, even though they're both about the commodification of nature. One major thing that the book give gives us the opportunity to kind of unpack, you say, is this like inconvenient issue of nature being so vulnerable to human power, um, which is it's chilling to kind of hear it put in those terms, but it's correct, right? Like this is why people have come to accept this idea that nature is a free gift, as it were. So we shouldn't fault the boy in the story because he exerts that power, but try to sort of use the story perhaps to think about our own complicity, basically, within a very deadly system. um, but yeah, the way you frame it, kind of in the crux of the book, is that we must let go of the fantasy that we can step outside of human perspectives or human concepts of value. If this is anthropocentric, you say, I think it's also honest. Um, and I think, more than honest, you're arguing that it's like infinitely more responsible, you know. So it's almost like Shel Silverstein was trying to less so narrate the kind of tragic art of human selfishness, which he left to the neoliberals. And I want to talk about like the kind of key neoliberal ideologues and their conceptions of nature as you kind of expose it in the book. Like he was less doing that than really trying to give us a maybe a path to a less exploited nature and a less exploitative relationship to nature. I don't know. Um, but I do know there's a comedian named Kurt Braunohler who has an incredible bit on the Giving Tree, which maybe I'll try and stitch into this episode.
Oh, that would be great.
But like the book you've written is really it's focused on capitalism's modus operandi for commodifying nature or not commodifying nature. There's a moment where you write that capitalism is characterized by relentless commodification. So, the surprise is not so much that the failure to value many kinds of nature, but the fact that these incredibly useful activities, as you put it, haven't been priced and packaged by the market. One thing I wasn't totally sure about after I finished the book was whether you felt like these established economic concepts, so like the idea of the externality, natural assets, ecosystem services, for example, whether those things were productive at all for you, or if they fail really to capture the like costs that should and could be attached to nature, as it were, the life sustaining relationships that make up nature. So it's like, are these concepts productive precisely because they fail to do that accounting? And are they useful in any way to you as like a way of kind of building an alternative politics of nature?
Yeah, it's a really interesting question. I do think they're useful and productive for at least thinking about what's going on. And the book came out in a lot of ways of recognizing or sort of just seeing different versions of the same problem, or at least seeing environmental problems, and kind of contemporary, from climate change to biodiversity, kind of always framed in these same terms. It was either like a missing cost or like a missing price or something like that. And part of this is because I started writing this book like when this that was like in the moment of, when that was sort of the frame for doing climate politics. Like, you need a carbon tax on carbon emissions, or whatever it may be. But I think that's been really the dominant way of like conceptualizing environmental problems in politics, is through this language of economics, where it's like we need to either, yeah, we need to price them and bring them in. And I think that for me, I guess what's productive about those for me is that it does situate these problems as sort of about political economy rather than just about, again, like our sort of moral orientation towards the natural world, or like whether we have the right attitudes towards nature. Like, it does recognize that this sort of systemic quality to it that's about, uh, that's not just about anyone's individual like intentions or beliefs. And I think that was, for me, that seemed important in getting away from what I think has been the dominant framework in like environmental ethics and, some branches of moral philosophy that are much more oriented towards like we need to recognize intrinsic value of nature. We need to sort of, have a, undo Cartesian dualism. We need to sort of have a different attitude and relationship to the natural world, as if we could just kind of do that by like changing our worldview or something like that. And I think that economic literature and language does kind of like point us in the right direction, which is like, yeah, this actually is why this is happening, because most of what we're doing most of the time, is not going out and like interacting directly with the tree or the flower. It's like buying the book that the tree has been like pulped into the paper for, or like, the burger that the forest has been cut down to create like grazing pasture for the cattle or whatever. So like we're having most of our interactions with the natural world are mediated through like basically like our purchases, through like our interaction in, our interactions in a capitalist society. And so like I think that these frameworks of things like externalities or natural capital, as much as people can kind of find them like, have this revulsion at the idea of like putting a price on a forest or something, they're still like identifying the right kind of problem, or like this is how we should approach it through the lens of political economy. I think then the thing that I want to do is say, well, yeah, we can do that, but we can't just, like, when we actually push on these and dig in, actually it turns out that they're much more significant. Like something like the externality, these things that are unpriced, they're like incredibly significant. They're pervasive. They're everywhere. There's so many things that are not sort of priced and accounted for in, in like the market, which is supposedly the mode of social coordination. There's so many things that escape that kind of valuation, that are very, very difficult to bring inside it, and that to understand, sort of how and why those things happen, we also have to think about, like the what I would describe as the social relations of capitalism, and thinking in particular about class and market dependence and the ways that we're all sort of interpolated in these. So sort of taking those concepts and trying to do like a critique of them or push on them that like deepens sort of the analysis, or situates them more squarely within not just like the economy, but what is distinctive about capitalism and what's happening here.
Yeah, a lot to unpack there, of course. But let's maybe like I want to try and bring us back to that question of a kind of, dichotomy around the price of all of the services and activities that nature gives. Irreplaceable, right? You mentioned Biosphere 2, which has that lovely Matt Wolf documentary, Spaceship Earth, and half earth socialism also talks about, like, biosphere 2 as a really unique experiment in trying to demonstrate the infrastructural cost of these like these life support systems that nature gives for free. I was curious. It's like we're kind of in a box, like the advocates of pricing nature and the advocates of protecting nature from price, though, they have largely failed to protect it, right? So we seem to need some kind of a third way. And what we have, though, as you point out, is the proliferation largely of those natural capital accounting programs, which are, flawed in the sense that they just are kind of white noise, perhaps, in the economic system. The issue you say with monetizing life is that it can't possibly capture the intrinsic worth of, for example, whales as living sentient beings. Um, but yet, you're not content with sort of the standard spiritualism, perhaps, of environmentalism that likes to sacralize that nature. Um, because I guess, I mean, if I'm reading you correctly, it for you establishes like a pretty rigid normative sense of what nature is. And so I wondered if you could kind of, give us more context on this idea that, as you say, the problem comes when critics of capitalism play to moralize nature as a trump card. So things like appeals to symbiotic entanglements of the altruistic forest or the networked fungi, murmurations of birds. What's going on with that impulse, and what do you think the consequences are of kind of excluding the parts of nature that we can't easily domesticate also?
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, it's a great question. A lot of pieces to it. Yeah, I think there is this interesting dichotomy, and this speaks to some of what I was describing a minute ago, between, yeah, like these programs to say, okay, well, we have all these things that the ecosystems do for us that are so valuable. They keep the planet like functioning basically. Their price is so incredibly high. There's this one sort of famous study that valued the entire Earth's biosphere at $33 trillion, which at the time was like twice world GDP, and that was both kind of like this like gigantic sum, and then people were really pissed about it. So like, how dare you value the entire Earth? Like that's such a like ludicrous thing to do. And of course it is a ludicrous thing to do. Like you can't. A lot of these things are just a lot of the kinds of things that are described as ecosystem services, whether it's carbon sequestration or water filtration or soil fertility regeneration, they're all like they're incalculable in many respects. Both, even if we're just thinking about the physical properties and qualities, it's very hard. Like economists have spent a long time trying to come up with ways to kind of like come up with estimates for the kind of contributions of things that aren't appearing in the market, and like how do you like estimate how much how valuable these services are. So there are a bunch of like quantification techniques, and everyone recognizes that they're kind of like not that good. That they don't really capture other like the kind of biophysical elements, or the fact that most of these sort of activities exist in relation to one another. So you can't just like take apart the ecosystem and it still works. Like it all has to be connected and continuing to function. So you have to have like all of these different organisms and so on. But yeah, there are a lot of problems with like efforts to value or to come up with like these assessments of what the economic value of these services are. But I think one of the major responses, yeah, has been from moral critics who say this is just wrong. It's wrong to put a price on a whale or a tree or some other kind of like non-human entity that should be valued for as intrinsically worthy in some way, or it's like, yeah, spiritually valuable, or something that is not appropriately valued in the market or in terms of like a price that you shouldn't be able to buy. And I am very sympathetic to these arguments because I do find them compelling, and I completely agree that like money can't capture like these things of like really profound significance. But I think that's true for a lot of things that already have prices. So I guess there's two pieces to why I feel uncomfortable with a moral argument. Is one is I think it's arbitrary. So people will say, oh, we shouldn't put a price on a whale, but they're buying a fish at the grocery store every day. We are buying and selling nature all the time. So like, why are some natures deemed like intrinsically valuable and priceless and others are not? Like, I think if we want to make that argument, you have to really carry it through, and then you're like, actually, we should not be buying and selling anything, and that's just like a straight up full anti-capitalist deep green argument, which you could make, but a lot of people who make that argument don't. um, and then on the other hand, I think it does suggest that there is something that is just good in nature itself, and that we should just like respect in some, I think, often quite vague way. And I again, like, I want to respect nature, whatever that means, or have a different and better relationship to the more than human world. But I think that this idea that you can just sort of say, well, nature is nature as it is good, usually tends to take some kind of image we have of nature, like it's like a harmonious forest or something. It's not the nature red in tooth and claw, or it's some version of nature we like, or it's like the whale and not the, I don't know, I don't know, some like algal bloom in the ocean, or the trees and not the pests that are eating them. There are so many different kinds of natures that are like constantly destroying each other and flourishing and unflourishing, and and that human societies are constantly interacting with and transforming. And it's just this thing that's constantly in flux, and I don't think we can kind of just say, well, these parts of it are like morally significant and these others aren't, or we're going to kind of say all of nature is morally significant, but we're not going to actually kind of we're just going to pick one piece of it and say this is like the model for society or why nature is good. We have to really kind of like assess what those relationships are and how we're relating to the natural world in a much more I think direct, way that really is grappling with those that change, and not just saying like, well, like uh we should not destroy nature, or like it has some imagined vision of like a previously harmonious nature that has since been destroyed and defiled, because I just don't think that's a very accurate way to think about how the more than human world works and how human societies exist within it.
Yeah, and I also feel like just like strategically, it doesn't resonate or capture people's attention to like leave it in the realm of a sacred nature. I mean, there are lots of kind of, studies now that show it's only a small percentage of people that are described as like ecophiles who have that like passionate attachment to nature. A lot of us live in cities and we're deeply disconnected from that nature, and we have other priorities. And if it's not just about meeting people where they're at though and conceding everything here. I think you still make the point that we have to politicize nature. It's just you want to kind of understand the where the levers really are, and it does feel to me uh, the way that you talk about pollution is opening onto that kind of mobilization, right? Like, um, it does seem like if there's a class war that one can point to and see as like a material political force for protecting nature, it's often in struggles against like air pollution, water contamination, resource extraction. Um, but like, the book that you've written isn't about the story of those struggles, right? It's a book that is theorizing, I think, that those political levers. It's almost like there should be a second book where you give the case studies on how fights against the force of environmental racism or whatever have been waged. But there is this idea, though, in the book that pollution is the quote, is it's the old sleek quote there. Pollution is the underside of the free gifts, spontaneous and limitless bounty, or seemingly limitless bounty. The laboriously manufactured detritus that no one's agreed to buy and no one wants. Um, and I guess my question would be like, when and how do you see what you call absorption power coming into play here politically, even like between states, between countries, between different regions? And where do we see like, those sites of absorption power being exploited? Um, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. So this chapter on pollution is trying to kind of take some of the work that a lot of people have done on thinking about things like environmental justice and the injustices of who bears the burden of pollution and things like that, and sort of think about those, but also try to like connect them to an argument about what Marx would call the hidden abode of production, and to say, well, these things are like to understand not only like how these are being distributed, but how and why they're being produced in the first place. Like how and why are we generating all of this toxic waste and like smoke and smog and whatever, carbon emissions, obviously. We can't just sort of focus on how they're unequally distributed, but we have to say, like, well, what's going on at this sort of point of production, and think about how, again, like thinking about like that, how that's structured, how pollution is emerging from the sort of process of commodity production, and it's this, I think it is a strange phenomenon because obviously, like, um, a lot of like Marx's analysis of capitalism, for instance, is about like how you go into the hidden abode and you see how like the stuff is made and the commodity is made, and the boss sort of disciplines and commands the laborers labor power and commands their ability to work, and they make the product, and then the capitalist sort of like takes the surplus, and the worker just gets their wage and has to come back the next day. It's like there's a whole analysis of that, how that works to make the commodity. But I think if we actually, if you do that same kind of going into the hidden abode of production, like you also see the stuff that's being produced that's not the commodity. It's like all the other crap that comes out, right? So like when you're transforming matter to make, from like steel to a car, there's a bunch of like excess stuff that's not part of the finished commodity, and that's often kind of what ends up in this kind of space of waste. Nobody is buying it on the market. It's just kind of this excess stuff that again doesn't have a price usually, and is but it's not like the free gift of nature that's like the ecosystem service, because it's not generally seen as like a positive thing that people want to be around. It's like a negative thing. And so then the question is, well, who has to deal with it? Like who has to kind of like just bear this excess stuff, and why? And I think that's where we can bring this kind of the analysis that Marx would bring to the kind of relationship between the capitalist and the worker, to think about how capitalists and capital relate to broader communities and societies, and in the course of like remaking the environment and remaking the atmosphere, in the course of commodity production, when they're like pumping smoke into the air, and people nearby are forced to kind of breathe it in. And I think that's an interesting analogy to the idea of labor power, because for Marx, labor power is like your bodily capacities that you sell to the capitalists, and then you kind of like use to work and make stuff, and then but you still own yourself at the end of the day. And there's a contract involved, and like how much time, and for how much a wage. But for this, with pollution, there's no contract usually. Like you can just, sometimes there's regulations on this stuff, but generally you just kind of, the default is you can just kind of dump stuff out into the world, into the river, or the skies, or wherever. And the people around it are also like, their bodily capacities are also sort of like active, and breathing it in or absorbing the toxic waste, so they're kind of being used in some way. But those people never agreed to enter into that relationship. They didn't sell their lung capacity to the capitalist. They're just sort of like being integrated into this production process without like having chosen to do so. So there's an interesting, I think there's like there is that relationship between capital and capitalists, and sort of proletarians in some way, but it looks very different in the context of pollution. And then of course it's also unevenly distributed across like race and geography and nation, and all of these things that we also have to bring into the picture to get kind of a more concrete sense of what's going on. But I think that like hopefully that frame can help us again situate some of the conversation around environmental justice within capitalism, and see some of the struggles as, I think, like struggles against the power of capital, kind of like produce whatever, to be that those are the people who decide what's getting produced and how and where and when and in what quantities. And a lot of, most of us don't have much say in sort of what's happening in that process. And so if we did, things might look a lot different, is what I want to kind of say in that chapter.
Yeah, I mean, I certainly felt a palpable lack of any agency when I worked at the steel factory in Hamilton, Ontario, Stelco.
Mm.
uh, for 2 summers.
Mm.
Got burned, had to absorb all measure of chemical byproducts and
Yeah.
asbestos and things like this. And yeah, I mean that's the sort of implicit trade-off, but it is implicit.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
I think a lot about the sort of relationship between absorption power and this sort of growing displacement of climate refugees and so-called sacrifice zones. And
Yeah.
my head's kind of spinning thinking about like absorption versus sacrifice, but maybe it makes sense to like shift gears a little bit, and talk about what I mentioned earlier, the neoliberal kind of prehistory of environmentalism, or maybe not quite that, but this is stuff that emerges in the 1970s, you say, in response largely to pollution, sudden visibility, and like just the empirical fact of it. And so you have to wrestle with that, and there are different strategies that emerge. I certainly lay it on thick when it comes to blaming capitalism for the root causes of the climate and biodiversity crisis. So, I resonated with lots of parts of this book. But the critique of free market ideology you give unveiled some of these things about free market ideology I didn't know. And yeah, like Friedrich Hayek in particular, Milton Friedman, the way that they think about and look at nature, as you say, like as something that can be taken without payment or replenishing, something that doesn't show up in the ledger. That was really interesting to me, but also like the fact that they had really weird ideas about natural disasters, or like how the market deflected responsibility for damaging nature, right? Like it just sort of takes away any moral questions, and says it's like up to the economy to decide how we use nature, how we convert it to other things, and what
Yeah.
have you.
Yeah.
Could you just like expand a bit on that? Because I found that particularly amazing. That's sort of.
Yeah. I'm glad that was interesting to you. And I think there are like maybe two pieces to it. And one is how they explicitly talk about nature, and then this kind of broader phenomenon that I came to think is really important. And maybe I'll actually start with the broader phenomena, which is just the way that I think neoliberals, but defenders of the market in general, have tended to defend it is basically as this way of divorcing intentions and consequences. The political theorist Eric McGilvray calls it like non-responsibility. And the idea is like you're not directly responsible for what you're doing in the market. You go and you buy something and other things happen, but that's not connected to you. You're not directly like firing somebody if somebody loses their job because you didn't buy the stuff they make, or you're disconnected in some way, and that's often been seen as a good thing. So it's like the invisible hand is supposed to produce like social benefits for everyone, even though nobody is like going out there and trying to make the world like a better place. They're going out and being selfish and greedy and like, I want this thing and I'm going to buy the stuff that I want. And they're kind of like self motivated. But the idea is that that kind of like harmonizes into like a positive, whatever kind of utopia. And I think that this is both interesting for a few different ways because, on the one hand, obviously, if it doesn't kind of produce this beautiful harmony and instead of producing like an ecological crisis, you're like, maybe that wasn't quite right. Maybe there's something off here. And I think things like the externality kind of point in that direction. But there's also something in that broader notion of responsibility that I think is interesting because so much of our discourse around like environmental politics or ethics is about like being responsible for our own actions and like our complicity and like the ways like our carbon footprint or something, right? That you can act in small ways to kind of like to make more responsible choices, that once we sort of take a look at our uh you know that there's something kind of dizzying about recognizing that like everything we do, everything we eat, everything, whenever we fly, whenever we kind of like just drive to work, like all of these things are contributing to this planetary crisis. And I think there's something valuable about that recognition because it is obviously, I think climate change is emergent from all of these like daily decisions and actions in a way that's really staggering. But at the same time, I think it can be kind of perverse to say like we have to be responsible for the effects of those things, like that like you're responsible for the emissions that your flight produce, and ergo for, I don't know, if somebody, a farmer, in, like some part of the world, suffers a drought and their crops die and they fail, and like you have in some way contribute to that. And on the one hand, you kind of have, but the whole point of like acting in the market is like you're not responsible for that, or like you're supposed to just go out and buy stuff. You're not supposed to think about like what's happening along the way, or how that affects someone else. Like that's what the market does, is to sort that out, and it's kind of just not, you can't even know, let alone like control it. And so I think that the way we tend to talk about this in the environmental space is like, well, we should be more responsible for like XYZ consumer choices, is just not how not how these thinkers imagine the system to work. And I think that points to a really like, if we want to actually be responsible for our relationship to nature and want to have some, to be able to say, well, we have chosen this in some way, that's not what we're going to get through a system where most of our actions are mediated by the market. So I think that's in general like a broader kind of way of thinking about the market that I think is quite pertinent to some of the problems of a lot of contemporary environmental discourse. But then there's also some really fascinating stuff in how I think, people like Hayek and Friedman are thinking about environmental problems in particular, because I think they recognize in a sense that um, if you have these, especially they're writing in like the 40s, 50s, 60s, in this post-war period that we now think of as a great acceleration, when you have a lot of post-war growth, but also like huge explosion of pollution problems, a lot of like movements around pollution, a lot of discourse around pollution. Economists are starting to pay attention to it more. And for people who are defenders of the free market, this is, they're worried because pollution is being framed as like a market failure, like something that the market isn't able to integrate, and potentially something really significant that could like kind of undermine the case for the market itself. Because again, if the idea is like the market will harmonize everything and produce like a best of all possible worlds, and in fact is producing this like like world of polluted air and water, and people are living in these sort of like hellscapes, then maybe the sort of case for the market is going to be undermined. And so they're very concerned about the externality and about these problems that seem to be like that they worry might be more significant than had been recognized. And I think they're right. Like Milton Friedman is like, this could undermine like the whole case for the market. And I'm like, yeah, if you really follow the externality, it kind of explodes a lot of the logic that they're sort of trying to defend. So there are a bunch of places where you can see them kind of showing concern about it and trying to figure out a way to deal with these problems. Hayek, he's like such an anti-state polemicist, even he says, well, I guess the state, like sometimes the state maybe needs to like use like an alternative to the price mechanism if deforestation is really bad, or like there are problems with runoff from farms. So he will recognize these sort of like environmental elements that end up being beyond the scope of the price system. So I just see these are small moments in their work, but I see them as these like indicators of like a much bigger problem that they kind of approach and then back away from and try to solve in some other way. But that if we kind of like keep following, it's like, yeah, there's something to that.
Yeah, it presents a kind of existential crisis for that neoliberal formula, which needs certain basic assumptions, like the tragedy of the commons and these sorts of things, to really just square the whole thing. And falls apart when people see and smell this externality that's, Friedman and others say really ideally should be invisible. Like ideally, people should not know. They're not supposed to know.
Yeah.
And personally, I guess struggle with that. Like there's this lovely, turn of phrase in the book where you say it was through pollution that the environment became visible. Quite literally, smog made air newly perceptible. Oil spills gave water an unnatural sheen. Have you ever kind of put thought specifically into why visibility seems to be so essential, and like what that says about like maybe different kinds of knowledge practices that we are so invested in the university, which are super, abstract? Like, what is it about the need for people to see and smell and taste the, less comfortable things about nature that seems to play such an important role in like political transformation, you know?
Yeah, it's a super interesting question, and I haven't thought about it a ton, but I had thought about it mostly in the case of around like climate change, in the absence of a lot of that visibility, where it's part of the problem with climate is that it's so hard to see, and um, like you don't see. I mean, you can see a natural disaster, but you don't like necessarily know what's causing it. You have to have like a lot of explanation to kind of make sense of these
Yeah.
things. You have to understand it. Like I have like a theory basically to understand these events. Um, and you can kind of track. I mean, like, yeah, over time you can sort of say, it seems warmer every summer, or like the crops are like, coming in earlier every year or whatever. But those are like, it's not the same as kind of going outside and being like, wow, I can't see in front of me because the sky is so, like the air is so polluted, or like the river is on fire, or there's like an oil spill, or all these sorts of things that happened over and over, especially in that post-war period, but, also prior to that, around industrialization. And I think, yeah, I mean, that I think has been very significant in how environmentalism as a political movement in the 20th century really took off, was really around, we in some ways making visible these things that we depend on. Like you don't notice them until they're gone, right? Like a lot of the natural world I think of as like kind of an infrastructure for our lives. I mean, not
Yeah.
necessarily that it is that, but it's how it
Yeah.
operates often, and you just you see it when it breaks down.
Yeah,
Uh,
water right now in Nova Scotia, where I am, is a topic when it was totally, unintelligible as a topic, as a thing that would appear in the news, I would say.
yeah.
To your point.
Yeah, totally, totally. It's like the things that we just sort of take for granted until they're suddenly, suddenly it turns out like they can um, stop working in the same way. And I do think we've tended to think of nature as this again, like kind of like realm of unchanging things. Like it's just the sun rises every day, and like so far, but like the like this is there are these cycles that just are perpetually occurring, but they've changed like pretty drastically. And we sometimes don't recognize there are things that you don't think can change until you start to see it, and then you're like, oh wow, this is not sort of the sort of steady background that we thought. And there are other ways, I guess, to experience that. I do think temperature can be other sort of like physical experiences of the things that can be significant, but sight and sort of the smell are like such tangible and immediate ones, and often go along with environmental problems that are like more immediate, or like kind of the causes and effects are more immediate, like somebody's um, you know pumping smoke out of like the factory smokestack. You can see it and smell it immediately, whereas with climate change, like it's like decades later it starts to get a little warmer, and that temporal lag is obviously one of the really tricky things about climate change.
Yeah, I think like that seems to be the key problem, and maybe it's insurmountable. Like it's possible that there are certain things that we simply can't visualize that are like these hyper objects or just represent something so sublimely like the earth does have a kind of alterity. It is beyond us. So that's a struggle. And I think one of the ways that you definitely engage with that problem in the book is through this language of the rights of nature, which you
Mm-hmm.
you know had a I thought like a unique uh, perspective on, especially when you just raise the question of like, what kind of rights are we talking about? We sometimes assume we know what kinds of rights, like legal rights, that represents. Is it like the rights of a citizen? You ask, do we mean collective bargaining rights? We have to speak for nature, it feels like, until it starts to hit back, until there's this kind of, it starts to make itself felt. Could you kind of just talk about, like your sense of the limitations, I guess, of this discourse, which does have purchase to some extent, I think, in a lot of different spaces.
Yeah.
I was really curious to hear more about that.
Definitely. Yeah, the rights of nature, I think, is a really interesting concept. And what I found very interesting about it is that the original paper that sort of was like the landmark rights of nature paper by Christopher Stone, I think 1972, it's like Should Trees Have Standing? And it's about whether trees should be able to be like represented as legal subjects. And it's a really interesting paper in many respects. But the thing that I found fascinating was that it was framed originally as a response to this problem of like social cost and pollution, and to Ronald Coase, who's one of the sort of preeminent neoliberal theorists of social cost and pollution, and basically like starts imagining the rights of nature as a way to kind of like collectivize action amongst, or like to create a platform sort of for collective action amongst people who are affected by pollution. And so the example is like if you have a lake and like a mill is dumping some pollutant into the lake, everyone who lives around the lake probably wants us to stop. But maybe that it's not, for any individual person, it's probably not worth it to go to war against the mill and try and get them to shut down. But if they all were, working together, they could, they could challenge the mill and make them, like put on a filter or whatever, or stop producing the
Like on
same
behalf
thing.
of the lake, like as a voice of the water body itself. Yeah.
Exactly. And so the lake becomes, he's like, well, what if the lake could bring the charge? Like the lake can be the sort of collective body that like brings these people together and it sort of speaks for everyone around it. And then he's like, and then the lake could also speak for like, the birds and the fish and these other creatures that are like totally unrepresented in law, and who are totally unrepresented in a lot of economic, transactions. And from there, it's like, well, the lake becomes this kind of this like institution almost for like what I describe as like collective bargaining, almost like multi-species collective bargaining, that the same way you have a union, and that's like the institution that makes it possible for workers to sort of like join forces against their boss. That the rights of nature, when we see it from that kind of angle, you can see like the lake or the river or whatever as having this kind of institutional force that can stand up to like developers or whoever might be trying to convert it into something else or dump shit in it or whatever they might be doing. And so for me, that was like a frame or sort of shift in frame, or a way to think about a shift in frame in the rights of nature, away from just, because I think we often think of the rights of nature as just being like defending the intrinsic value of the the natural entity in question, or kind of recognizing its significance in some way. And those things I think can be important, but I think it gives it a little bit more thrust if we have the sense of like this is a political institution that we can use in a fight against like the like capital that's trying to destroy these things, or like turn them into something else, and can be this more like more politicized version of thinking about what rights are and what they do, rather than that they just recognize intrinsic worth, like the kind of human rights vision, and more like they're more like labor rights. They're more like this kind of way to give you standing in a political struggle.
I love it. I mean, I think that angle is particularly powerful. That there's a lot of power in it, and it's something I've heard Kara Daggett talk about. I know you briefly,
Mm,
mentioned
mhm, mhm.
energy in the book. She certainly has this sense that like we need to be thinking about dependency here, right? How dependent we are. But when it comes to really dwelling with that fact, it's difficult to bring people to it. Perhaps there's a passage that really stands out to me that captures it. The it's chilling, really. You say that I had it right here. You write, our making of the world is so thoroughly out of our control, so the entire planet increasingly becomes an alien force standing over and against us. The problem isn't rooted in alienation from nature, but in alienation from ourselves and from one another, from our practices, our actions, our responsibility, our freedom. It feels like that's what you're getting at in terms of your take on the rights of nature. It's not like nature is right; it's nature has rights, right? Rather than seeing nature as this like perfect, pristine thing that we need to emulate, um, it's more we need to really reacquaint ourselves with this uh, uh, deeply human and outsized power over nature, and come to terms with that. That seems to be a big part of the book. But I wonder if you could just like reflect on the passage, because it does seem like you're doing a certain kind of theoretical work here that I like a lot, where you're saying that there is this alien force standing over and against us, rather than it just merely being some kind of uh, almost ineffable alienation. Like we can't somehow put our finger on it. Instead, you say squarely it's about, capitalist unfreedom, right?
Yeah, exactly. And I think, that is really trying to, to get at this sense of, again, like moving away from a frame that's just about the that the whole problem is about some distance from the natural world, even if we often have that, and more like what is sort of at the heart of that or at the root of that, and that there's something about the ways that we're compelled to act and be in the world towards one another as human beings, but also towards the non-human world, and that we are kind of, I think, constantly compelled to treat nature as a free gift, and um, to like discount it in this way, even if we would really rather not. And again, speaking to the sort of problem of like it's not about our attitudes or our kind of beliefs or things like that, because we often have quite strong attitudes and beliefs, and yet people find themselves like feeling helpless in the face of that. And I think that felt like an important thing to try to speak to, because I certainly feel that a lot of the time, like where I feel like I want to do, I want to act in such a way, in a way that is like in keeping with my, like values or what I think is important, and yet like find it very difficult to do so often, or feel like what you do has no, kind of bearing on what happens. And I think that kind of perplexity you see all the time in writing on climate, which is like, I feel, like, yeah, this kind of like paralysis almost, or like, what to do. And I think that is speaking again to this like sense of, um, yeah, like this alienation from, again, from our actions, so this inability to like connect like who we are and what we think and believe to what happens in the world, or like the world that we are constantly making, and we are making it all the time, but in ways that feel like very much not of our choosing. So and I think that what I try to, to talk about that is how capitalism is, the force compelling that, in both, in the sort of system of class relations, but also how we're interpolated and kind of, how we mostly relate to one another and to the natural world through, again, kind of like not just like consumption, but through like this interactions in the market, which have this kind of force of their own, and which compel us in different ways, and which kind of interpolate into us in different ways, and which aren't, we're not in control of what comes out at the other end. And that's, again, like that goes back to our previous conversation, that's the point. And so trying to kind of attend to that, and like this is like, maybe this is why I think we feel so like, um powerless in the face of what we would want to happen.
Right. Yeah, I think that's true. And I think, it leads us to fall prey to certain kinds of cynicism and political realism. Like we're certainly seeing that in Canada right now with the
Hmm.
rollback, the walking back of so many climate initiatives under, Mark Carney's leadership. Um, and, I don't sense that people generally are conceding to it. It's not reducible to that, I think. Um, because because of the thing you're pointing to, which is, I think, Ingrid Waldron talks about the lack of a kind of structural competency, right? That we don't always think with the kind of macro level view of how economic relations are determined. It's very difficult to kind of dwell in that space. It's easier in a lot of ways to place individual blame on, the billionaire technocrats that just sat down with Donald Trump, which why wouldn't you, right? There's a spectacular nature to that. And I guess like one of the things I found really valuable about the kind of, the solutions that you're offering is that, it is about trying to move beyond hope versus fear, pessimism versus optimism. Even, I mean, like the book is not concerned with right versus left populism or like Chantal Mouffe's sense of this emerging eco-populism. It's more about trying to dwell in this space of like an ambiguous freedom, as you put it, which is, I see a lot of echoes of Sarah Stein Lebrano's book, Don't Talk About Politics, which I talked to Lebrano about for this podcast. And she, like you, is really more invested in, trying to encourage people to dwell with their own cognitive dissonance about the agency they do have, right? Because that moment of disconnect between how you prefer to live your life, how you prefer to relate to others, how you prefer to relate to nature, and the way in which you're kind of compelled to, should produce some sort of outcome, right? Rather than it just existing as this kind of mental static. But I guess the last question I wanted to ask you is about the the state of maybe the public or public's receptivity to a certain kind of anti-capitalism, right? Because I think it's there I think certainly, certain parts of social media are very receptive to this idea that capitalism, of course, is at the core of the pollution crisis, the plastics crisis, the climate crisis. Um, but it does feel as though what your book is pointing out is that there's a little bit of kind of nuance still missing in terms of the kind of anti-capitalism where the digestible anti-capitalism perhaps that we're fed online and the level of more robust anti-work, for example, capitalism that maybe we need in this future that actually tries to restore a relationship to this thing that we've taken as an open sewer and a free gift for basically our entire history, right?
Yeah. Yeah, I think definitely, yeah, on the last piece of the question, I definitely think there are, many ecological critiques of capitalism. And, in some sense, I think that capitalism is doing this is not, not a new idea, but when I'm trying to get a little more fine grained about some of the ways that I think that's operating, or how and why, what I think some of those mechanisms are, that are, by which capitalism is sort of, like, kind of like relating to nature, kind of pushing individual people to relate to nature and things like that, and trying to kind of just like understand with a bit more detail, like what exactly is going on there. So that's definitely one piece of it. But I'm glad you mentioned the kind of like moving beyond optimism, pessimism too, because I really, I do feel like I have often found that frame very frustrating. The kind of like, are you optimistic or pessimistic or whatever? And it's like, well, I don't know. It just feels to me really just almost like a meaningless frame in some ways. And I think, I did a bunch of work on the Green New Deal, and people would always sort of assume that I was like an optimist on climate because I was doing all of this kind of political, like trying to like envision like a way forward. And it's like, I'm like an incredible pessimist, that like you have to do things, and we have to kind of recognize the state of the world, like recognize what we're in. It's an incredibly difficult problem. It's going to be, I think, quite brutal as like a sort of future in many ways, and yet like what is there to do but try to keep figuring it out and like pushing forward and trying to find new ways to think about this problem and think about struggles around this problem, and like move into this quite frightening and uncertain future, recognizing that there's going to be like a lot of really, I think, like suffering and horrible things that are going to happen from, again, like natural disasters. And some of this, like, again, like I started my climate journey in like a city completely destroyed by a not natural disaster. And so I feel like that has really informed some of my kind of orientation to some of this, which is like, it can be very bad and probably will be. And yet, like, you can't just kind of give up and be like, well, it's too late. We're pessimists. So like, whatever, throw in the towel. There's always sort of ways that things can change. It can always get worse, for one thing. And there's always sort of like a new, like, set of opportunities and challenges to work through. And I think that is really the kind of task ahead for all of us in the 21st century, and for, political thinkers, political actors, and so on. So, trying to take this like position of, I don't know, like sober, like have a sober perspective on things, but not kind of then decide that that means anything is possible or nothing is possible, because we have to just kind of keep plugging along.
Yeah, no, yeah, like it's not a prescriptive, that's the whole idea, right? It's not this ambiguous notion of freedom, but there is still obviously in the book this dedication to um, what you've been calling environmental justice, and the emergence of an economy that isn't built on disposability and externality and debt. You say in the book, what should we do with the world we've already made, with the highways, nuclear waste, parking lots, right? These are decisions that are not in, it feels like, anyone's control, right? It feels like it's determined, as you say, by market and class rule. But these are incredibly important choices. And I really appreciate you giving us like this framework for really breaking it down. It's a incredibly valuable and super rigorous book. Thanks for writing.
Thank you so much. I'm really glad it was, interesting to you and helped you thinking in some way. So it's been great to talk about it.
Yeah, yeah. And my coworker was pointing to like this meme I didn't know about. There's like a hamster, and it says, "The horrors persist, but so do I." Sort of the message, you know what I mean? In some ways, is there are of course reasons to be incredibly pessimistic, but you say, the deteriorating material conditions we face don't force us to harden borders against climate refugees, hoard resources, or throw others off the lifeboat, as Garrett Hardin would have it, right? They don't
Yeah.
force us down the path of climate barbarism. That's happening at the kind of cultural and ideological level. And I think your book does a good job of demystifying a lot of that stuff. So thanks for
Uh,
talking with me.
Yeah, well, I'm so glad, and I really hope so, because I feel like we need to resist all of those things as much as we possibly can. So, yeah, thanks again for having me.